we start homeschooling, it can be very hard to have perspective. And so what I want to suggest that you do and encourage you to do is to start your homeschooling of your child by asking yourself a question, which is, when I'm 60 or 70 and I'm looking back on my children, where do I want them to be? What are the most important things in their lives? What are the things that I want them to, where I can sit back and say, I'm pleased with how they were raised? When you consider success and whether you were successful in homeschooling or not, it really starts with getting a correct definition of success. You have to have a goal. And maybe your goal is the same as the goal of public education, but the goal of public education has changed over time. When public schools became mandatory in the mid-19th century, they were established because there were many Roman Catholics that were moving over from Ireland. And so all of a sudden the U.S. culture gets a bunch of people that have never read the Bible. And so that was the purpose for public education, was to make sure everybody in the culture had read the Bible. That's pretty far from what the current goal is of education. But when they establish it, when the government funds it, they're funding it and they're establishing it because they have very specific goals. They're not just saying everybody can do whatever they want, we just think this is a good idea. They're trying to do something with the society when they establish public schools. And certainly one of the most significant things that they're doing, well, there's two significant things that they're doing. One is to try to reduce juvenile delinquency. If you have parents that aren't watching their children, especially young men, they tend to be very bad. This is where we get the gang systems. The gang systems have been around since before public education started. And one of the things of public education, which is why you have to be in school until you're 16, is that they didn't want you out of school causing trouble. And so one of the goals of education is constraint. And then the other goal of education, the public education system, the other primary overriding goal is to get uniformity of society, to get everybody thinking the same way. Now, when you think about that, understand that they haven't achieved this very well, but this has been their goal for many decades. For 170 years, this has been the goal. This is why Hitler, one of the first things that he did was establish a public education system that was mandatory for everybody, so everybody could understand Nazi doctrine. And this continues to be the goal of the public education system, to get the whole society to think the same way. And now, it's hard to find out from the government what their goals are, but I think it's worth considering from the National Education Association what their goals are, because the majority of teachers are members of the NEA, and the NEA sets the agenda for the public schools by setting the agenda for the teachers. And the first thing to understand is that the agenda for the public schools is to provide jobs for teachers. When they tell you they need smaller classroom size, understand that means more jobs, that means the union grows. The NEA is first and foremost a union, and the purpose of a union is to get higher wages and more job opportunities for the members of the union. So when the media goes and they talk to the NEA and they go, these are the experts in education, understand what they are really the experts in. They're experts in growing the education establishment. But aside from that, they're very specific about what their goals for the schools are. I looked at their website this morning. This is very public. The first goal is to implement racial justice. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad goal, but as we look at Black Lives Matter and we see the riots in the streets, understand that this is the language that they were taught, because this is the first goal listed for the NEA for what education should do. The second one is to prevent violence and bullying. Again, good things, but not about preparing your child to work, not about being successful in the marketplace, not about being talented, no, it's about stopping violence and bullying. Another one is supporting students with different abilities. And what they're saying there is you need to make sure that you go with the slowest so that nobody gets left behind, so that you support students of different abilities. The next one is supporting LGBTQ youth. And the last goal of the NEA is to promote gender equality. Now, this is important for us to understand because if all we do is replicate the public schools, then what we're saying is that our goal is to implement racial justice, to prevent violence and bullying, to support students with different abilities, supporting LGBTQ youth, and promoting gender equality. If all you do is say, well, I just want to continue them on the same path, then you're saying your goals are the same. And what I want to say is the first thing you do when you decide to homeschool is figure out what your goals are. Don't just adopt the goals of the public school system. Now, these may be the same goals that you have, or they may not be. But don't be blind. The public school is setting goals. They're saying this is what we define as success in education. And you need to make sure that you're saying, this is how I'm going to define success in education, because if you don't, there are plenty of people that will do it for you, that are doing it for you already. So if you just go along and say, well, this is the book that they would be using if they were going into fourth grade, like they were expected to go into fourth grade in this spring, this fall. Understand that purpose of that book, the reason the teachers chose it, was to fulfill the goals of the NEA and of public schools. So too often we can get so focused on what we're doing right now that you go, I'm overwhelmed, all of a sudden I have these children at home, I need to figure out how to teach them, that we can see the trees and ignore the forest. And I want to encourage you to take a step back and look for the forest too before you just see the trees. The old saying is, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And there'll be plenty of people who point out, take this road. Just do what public school did. Well, you know where their road is intending to end. So don't be as concerned about the road. Remember the destination. If you want to be successful at homeschooling, think about the destination. And one of the things that I remind parents frequently is you're not raising children. You already have children. You're raising adults. You don't have adults. The point of education is to prepare adults, not to raise children. And I know that's what we mean, but when you use the term raising children, all you do is think of this holding pattern where you're just trying to keep up, you're just trying to keep where you are. But that's not the purpose of education. The purpose of education is to say, this is where I want them to be. How can I help get them there? I want them to be adults. How can I help get them there? So you need to consider what you consider, because they are your children. They are your responsibility. When you are 70 and you're sitting in your rocking chair and you're looking at your family, you're not going to go, but that fourth grade teacher, he did a terrible job. If only. You're going to say, either my family brings me joy or my family brings me sorrow. You're going to say, either I was successful, I did the best I could, I directed them the best I could. You're the one that's going to sit there and say, did I do the right thing? And so you better be thinking now, at that point in time, what is the right thing? And then you structure your homeschooling to meet those goals. When my children are adults, what do I want them to be prepared to do? What do I want them to be? What do I want them to be like? And there's many different aspects of that you should think about and consider in your goal. But let me short circuit one of the easy responses. Because most parents, if you ask them when they're 70 and they're looking at their children who are 40 or 50, and you say, what do they want? What do you want them to be? And most parents go, I want them to be happy. Happiness comes from doing what you're good at, doing what you're successful at, doing what you're comfortable at. Happiness is a measure of success in meeting other goals. It is not a goal in itself. The person who's happy is the one who's saying, I'm doing what I should be doing. So of course we all want our children to be happy, but if all you seek for happiness is, you won't find it. Happiness comes from fulfillment. Happiness comes from not destroying yourself. Happiness comes from being where you should be instead of being where you shouldn't be. So with that, let me give you some areas to consider in terms of goal setting. And the first area is character. So why start with character? Because if you don't start with character, all the rest of them become meaningless. All the rest of them, it doesn't matter how great they are academically, if they don't have the diligence to go out and keep up in their field, they will rapidly fall behind. If they don't have the perseverance, it doesn't matter what a great athlete they are. They will never be successful in athletics unless they can persevere when it gets hard. And one of the first aspects of character is self-control. This will have more to do with whether they're happy than anything else. If they always just choose what pleases them, they will always be miserable because there will always be more pleasures to seek. If you don't teach your children to accept the fact that they can't get everything that they want, they're not going to achieve happiness because desire is insatiable. As soon as you get it, you want more. So what you need to teach your children is self-control, and how much you focus on this is a decision you need to make, but if you don't have any focus on this, your household is going to be miserable. Your children will spend their lives being miserable because unless they can control themselves, unless they can control their desire for pleasure, in the end, they will destroy themselves. But you also have to ask other questions of character. How about manners? How do you want them to behave around other people? And these things take work. It takes work to get your child to have self-control. You need to put them in situations where they have to exhibit self-control, and then you need to punish them when they fail to. And you go, that seems mean, but that's how you teach people things. And same with manners. You have to make them talk to older people. It requires them being around people that act properly. You look at the manners in our society, and what do we expect if you have 30 people all the same age? You don't expect them to be respectful to other people. You don't expect them to show kindness and other things. Instead, they're used to just dealing with people that are just like them. Part of manners is learning how to deal with people that aren't like them. And part of schooling, you actually have to school them in that. You actually have to say, I'm going to have you in a situation where it's going to be hard to be polite and that you need to be polite. But there's other aspects of character. Another one's sympathy. Caring for others and not just being self-centered. How do you make somebody sympathetic? You allow them to see suffering. You allow them to feel suffering. If all you do is avoid any difficult situations for your children, they'll never understand suffering. They'll never understand sympathy. The reality is to build character requires perseverance. It requires difficulties. And that means in homeschooling, you have to go do some difficult things if you want them to be sympathetic. You have to deal with people that are suffering. During the last panel, I told the story about somebody who they had to shut down all their homeschooling and everything because they had to suffer on just caring, the nursing care for a dying parent. Well, their children learned how to sympathize. They learned how to understand what suffering was like. They learned how to deal with it. These are things that will be more useful to them in their life than solving a quadratic equation. And so you need to ask yourself, how much goal do I want? And then choose to put things into your schooling that achieve that goal. Empathy is another one. Empathy is being able to look at somebody else without having experienced the suffering and look at them and be able to appreciate the situation that they're in. And that takes work to get people to empathize with one another. But we look at our country right now, and our country is so divided because children aren't taught to empathize with others. They aren't taught to look at people in other situations and say, I can understand your situation. Our schools aren't teaching character very well. But if you want your child to be successful, the way most of us in practical means would define success is you want them to care about other people. Some other basic ones, hygiene. You want to teach them to be clean. You want to teach them how to present themselves. Promptness. This is a big problem that most homeschoolers have. They fail to teach promptness. This is one thing that regular schools typically are better. If you don't turn it in by 3 o'clock on this day, you get a 0. When you're talking to your mother, too many mothers go, I'll give you till tomorrow. The reality is promptness is a great virtue that I need to improve on. But promptness is a great virtue, and you should be asking yourself, do I want this for my children so that other people can rely on them? If they say they're going to be there at 5, that they'll be there at 5. Diligence, perseverance. These are things that you really need to consider. And like I was saying before, like with math, the reason that you make them do all those problems at the end of that chapter when they go, I got it after the first one, is to teach them to persevere. The reason that you make them keep going back, even though they keep going, I don't get it, instead of just going, here's the answer, is you teach them to be diligent. These are the things that will pay off. If you persevere, that's how you're successful. Right? The old saying is 10% inspiration, 90% perspiration is how somebody's successful. You need to teach people, your children, to persevere. In the end, the character of your children will have more to do with their success as we define success in this culture than anything else. And that's taught in school. It used to be schools were very much that, I look at my second grade, grade card, and all it talks about on there are, how is he in diligence? How is he in promptness? How is he in, this is what the grade schools used to grade on, not how good does he write letters, because they understood that character is the foundation that you accomplish all these other things. And if you don't teach them character, in the end, all these other things will fail. It doesn't matter how much knowledge they have if they don't have the perseverance to go do the whatever work it is with that knowledge. That knowledge is a waste of time. So you should think about what goals do you want for your children's character. Also academics, you could figure out what goals do you want. Like I said in the panel again, that the goal for my boys was that they graduate, they have a bachelor's degree by the time they turn 19. Now I had that for various reasons. For my family it made sense. And I'm not saying use my goals. What I'm saying is you have to set goals if you want to get anywhere. And academic doesn't need to be specialization either. If you say he's very gifted in drawing, then what you say is I want him to be at this state at that point in time, so I'm going to teach him the things that he needs to do that. And you say not just even generally academic, but what specializations should he learn? And you don't know this when they're 6. But you should also be saying, I want him to be able to provide for himself in a field. And so therefore, as he grows up and I see his aptitudes, I'm going to say I'm going to train him so he can provide for himself in that field. Too often we think that the academics are so important. But the academics, right, if they learn to read and they have character, they can go figure out the rest. You don't need to teach them all the details. You know, my wife, when we were talking about doing this, she said something like, I haven't homeschooled in 15 years because our goal was to teach our children to learn for themselves so that we didn't have to do any more work. All we had to do is say, read this, read that. And again, when you think of them academically, they have to exceed you if they're going to be if they're going to be an expert in a field that's not your field. They have to exceed you. And so you have to say, we're going to give you enough focus in an area to achieve. Another area is, artistic. That doesn't ignore the academic aspect of it, but art takes work. Art really means to be an artisan. It means to be somebody who's skilled at something. And there's some people that your child, depending on what their gifts are, you should say, my goal for him is to be the best carpenter that he can be, the best painter that he can be, the best musician that he can be, because this is where his gifting is. And you need to say, knowing that if you said this child is going to be a carpenter, what you would be teaching him in 9th grade would be a lot different than if you say this child is going to be a physician. And you need to be saying, I know he's never going to go get his MD. What he wants to do is build things, so I'm going to go build a shed out back when he's 12 or 13 because that will help move him towards where he wants to be. Because I have a goal that he'll be not just average, but skilled at something. Another area that you need to consider in terms of goal for your homeschool is citizenship. How they act as citizens of our country. We have real responsibilities in this country. And you need to ask yourself, what's my goal for my children? Do I want them to be prepared to participate in our democracy? And you can choose not to do any of that. You can choose not to be involved. Or you can say, I think it's really important that they're involved. So when they're 10, I'm going to have them go meet the legislators. They'll be happy to meet with you. I'm going to go to a protest because I agree with this, because I want to get my child involved. This is all schooling. This is all saying this is the goal. The goal is to say that they're a productive citizen in this society. And so then the means are, I'll get involved with a campaign. You need to ask yourself, how important are these things to you, and how important do you think they should be to your child? The people who are successful, the people who are successful in politics typically start at 10. They don't start at 25. Now, there's exceptions. But they start early. And so you need to ask yourself the question, how important do I think this is? And again, interests are also driven by environment. They're not just driven by, this guy has the gift of gab, so therefore he'll be a politician. It's if you think politics are important and you say politics are important, you will develop your homeschool to achieve that goal. What you decide is important. Hey, one of the most important areas of schooling is to prepare them to be part of a family. Most people spend more time being a husband or being a wife, being a mother or being a father than they'll ever spend at their job. And we think of schooling as, you learn all these academic things. There's a lot more important things to learn that they need to know to be successful. There's a lot of people who would go, he's a millionaire now, but he's been divorced 3 times and all his children hate him. And when they're 70 and they look on their son, they would go, he's unsuccessful, even though he's wealthy. Because most parents would look at their children and say they're successful if they're successful in their family. So think about what that means. That means in your schooling, you should be thinking about how do they interact with grandparents. You should be thinking, how do you show them what a husband should look like? How do you show them what a wife should look like? How do you teach them so that they can teach the next generation? If your goal is to raise somebody that's going to be a member of a family, which the vast majority of people are, that determines things about how you should be training them in the first place. Too often we can think of homeschooling as schooling in these secondary things because all you're trying to do is transfer education to them. That's not what schooling is. Schooling is preparing them to be an adult. Another part of being an adult is to be able to provide. You know, how many people graduate? I was making a joke before about if you don't want your child to be 26 and living in your basement. Well, the way to have them be 26 and living in your basement is don't think that a goal of your homeschool is to teach them to be able to provide for themselves. Because if you don't teach them how to provide for themselves, you should expect to continue to provide for them. And this is important. You can't just go, oh, I'm going to teach them all these academic things and then provision will take care of itself. Having them spend a whole bunch of time on something that will never pay for them to live is not being a blessing to your children, not truly caring for them. The best way, this goes back to character for provision, is if you teach them a work ethic from an early age, if you teach them that they are supposed to work, that they have real things to do in this life, then they'll be able to provide for themselves. At some level, there's always opportunities for a strong back that's willing to work. And another area is you want them to be a leader. This is one advantage, a huge advantage that homeschools have over public schools. Public schools teach to an average. They try to get everybody at a same standard, same level. Homeschoolers, because you can take an area and you can start them. My son started programming at 10. You can take an area so that by the time they're 21, they're 10 years ahead all their peers. Guess who's going to be the leaders? Homeschools have a great advantage being able to prepare leaders for the next generation. And you should ask yourself, is that the aptitude of my child? Would that be good for my child? Would that be good for the world around? When you think of goals for homeschooling, don't just say, can I match the scope and sequence of public schools? Public schools have an agenda. If you don't want their agenda, you need to be asking yourself, what should my agenda be? And how should I use the time that I have with my child to get them to meet the goals? So again, when you're 70, you can look back and say, I prepared them for where I want them to be. You will look back. The question is, how will you answer the question? Thinking about the question now can prepare you to answer the question in a way that will make you happy, rather than a way that you look back in sorrow and misery. So setting goals for homeschooling is about the future of your children. What kind of adults will they be?